His empire, built on the degradation of women, crumbled in a single night, not by bullets but by the crushing weight of dishonor. He was transformed from a feared predator into an outcast, a ghost in his own territory, a man no one would dare touch, speak to, or even look at. This is the story of Bumpy Johnson's most sacred rule in Harlem, the invisible line that separated crime from depravity, and the social annihilation of the man who arrogantly crossed it. We delve into the complex moral code that governed the underworld, where certain sins were considered business, but others were a violation of the soul of the community, demanding a punishment far deeper than death. This man's downfall is a case study of how Bumpy Johnson wielded respect and reputation as weapons, proving that the worst sentence is not to be killed, but to be erased from social life while still breathing. The story takes place in the late 1950s, a time when Harlem, despite its struggles, maintained a strong sense of community and pride. There was an unwritten order in the streets, a set of rules that transcended official law, and Bumpy Johnson was its main guardian. Into this ecosystem, a new player emerges. Silky Sid, a pimp from Chicago, with a flamboyant style and a cruelty that was shocking even by underworld standards. Sid didn't see Harlem as a community, but as a virgin market. He began operating with a brutality that disregarded local conventions. The line was crossed on a cold November night, when one of his young prostitutes, a local girl who had fallen on hard times, tried to escape. Sid savagely beat her in public, on the corner of a residential street, leaving her bloodied and humiliated as an example to the others. The act was not merely violent, it was a desecration, a display of power that violated the sanctuary of the neighborhood. The fatal mistake of Silky Sid was his inability to read the environment. In Chicago, perhaps, such brutality was an acceptable show of force. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. Bumpy's most valuable rule, the line no one crossed, was the protection of innocent civilians, the children, the families, the women who weren't part of the game. He understood that his power and legitimacy in the eyes of the community came from his position as a protector against chaos, not as an agent of it. Prostitution and gambling were businesses, confined to certain locations, and operated with a degree of discretion. Violence was a tool to be used surgically against other players, but terrorizing the community, bringing brutality to people's doorsteps, and victimizing women in a way that robbed them of their humanity, that was breaking the social contract. Sid, in his arrogance, didn't see this distinction. He saw Bumpy's initial silence not as deliberation, but as weakness, believing that the king of Harlem was too old or indifferent to care about the fate of a single prostitute. Bumpy Johnson's philosophy of power was deeply rooted in his understanding of community. He knew that fear could ensure obedience, but only respect could guarantee loyalty. Harlem wasn't just his business territory, it was his home, the ecosystem that sustained him. Allowing an outsider like Sid to impose an unchecked regime of terror would undermine the very foundation of his authority. It would signal that he was no longer the neighborhood's protector, but just another predator. News of the public beating reached Bumpy not as a crime report, but as a shockwave of outrage that swept through the community. The aunts, who watched everything from their windows, the shopkeepers who had known the girl since childhood, the men who felt powerless and disrespected in their own neighborhood. The collective murmur reached Bumpy like a plebiscite. He didn't need to investigate. He was summoned to act by the court of Harlem's public opinion. His response couldn't simply be punishment. It would have to be a restoration of order and honor. Contrary to Sid's expectation of a gang war or a direct confrontation, Bumpy's strategy was entirely psychological, designed to destroy Sid using the very values of the community he despised. Bumpy didn't send armed men, he sent messengers. His most respected and well-dressed men visited one by one every establishment in Harlem, the barbershops, the restaurants, the jazz clubs, the pool halls, even the churches. They made no threats. They simply delivered a calm and clear message from Bumpy himself. The man known as Silky Sid has dishonored our house. He is no longer welcome here. He does not exist. The message was simple, but the meaning was profound. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of social erasure. Bumpy was decreeing complete ostracism, a kind of social leprosy to be imposed not by his soldiers, but by the community itself. What followed was a stunning demonstration of Bumpy's true power. The next day, when Silky Sid left his expensive apartment, the world around him had changed. The doorman who had previously greeted him with an obsequious smile now stared right through him as if he were invisible. When he tried to have breakfast at his favorite restaurant, the waiter completely ignored him, serving everyone around him. He went to his usual barber shop, and the barber, who had cut his hair for years, simply said, "Sorry, sir, we're fully booked," while the shop was empty. The air around Sid became a vacuum. His own henchmen, sensing the seismic shift in power, began to distance themselves from him in the streets, afraid of being contaminated by his misfortune. Bumpy's trap wasn't a metal cage, but a cage of social isolation, built with the bricks of community contempt. Sid initially reacted with the only emotion he knew: anger. He tried to intimidate, shout, demand service. He threatened the waiter, who remained silent. He shoved the barber, who didn't react. His violence, once his greatest weapon, was now powerless. It was like punching smoke. Each act of aggression only deepened his outcast status, confirming to everyone why Bumpy's sentence was just. He couldn't fight an enemy who refused to acknowledge his existence. He was being defeated by silence, by indifference, by the collective withdrawal of human validation. His money, which he believed could buy anything, became worthless. Taxi drivers wouldn't stop for him. Shops wouldn't sell him anything. He was a rich man starving in a city of plenty, a naked king in a kingdom that refused to see him. The punishment was perfectly suited to his crime. He, who treated people as objects, was being reduced to nothing. The turning point for Sid was one night in one of Harlem's most popular jazz clubs, a place he considered his territory. He walked in, hoping his intimidating presence and wad of cash would restore order. But as he approached the bar, the bartender turned and began cleaning glasses. The jazz band, in the middle of a lively song, faltered and stopped playing. A deathly silence fell over the packed club. One by one, all the patrons slowly turned away, not to look at him, but to turn their backs on him. Within seconds, Sid was alone in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by a sea of cold shoulders. The disdain was a physical force, an invisible wall that suffocated him. In that moment, under the colorful stage lights, he finally understood. He hadn't been challenged to a fight. He had been judged, condemned, and excommunicated. His soul had been ripped from his body in public. The ultimate consequence was the disintegration of his empire and of himself. The women he controlled, sensing their powerlessness, simply left one by one. They didn't need to flee. He no longer had the power to stop them. His henchmen, seeing that their leader couldn't even afford a drink, abandoned him for the protection of other factions. In a matter of days, Silky Sid went from a feared pimp to a lonely, broken man, wandering the streets of Harlem like a ghost. Bumpy's punishment was to allow him to remain, so that everyone could see the result of crossing the line. He was a walking lesson, a monument to the rule. Finally, unable to bear the weight of ostracism, Sid packed his bags and left New York in the middle of the night, driven out not by weapons, but by the overwhelming force of collective contempt. The symbolic message of this event resonated for decades. Bumpy Johnson established, without firing a single shot, that there was a distinction between being a criminal and being a monster. He positioned himself not only as a crime boss, but as the guardian of community standards, the arbiter of what was and was not acceptable. The episode demonstrated that his deepest power lay not in his soldiers, but in his connection to the people of Harlem. He could mobilize the community itself as a weapon, a force far more subtle and devastating than any gang. He taught all who aspired to operate in his territory that there was a rent to be paid, and it wasn't just in money, but in respect for the unwritten rules that kept the social fabric intact. The historical impact was the solidification of the Bumpy era as a kind of Pax Harlemina, an imposed peace where, despite the underlying illegality, there was order and a code. The story of Silky Sid became a legend, told to young gangsters as an example of what happened when you forgot where you were. It prevented more predatory and chaotic forms of crime from taking root in Harlem during his reign. He established a moral boundary, and he was the only one with the authority to police it. This elevated his status from a mere gangster to an almost statesman-like figure in the underworld, a man who defined and enforced the law where official law could not or would not reach. The symbol left behind wasn't a crime scene, but silence. The silence of the jazz band, the silence of the bartender, the silence of the entire community turning away. It was a symbol of the power of withdrawn consent. It showed that a man only has the power that others agree to give him. By orchestrating the withdrawal of this mass consent, Bumpy carried out a form of social execution. He didn't take Sid's life, he took away his significance, which, for a man defined by his ego and reputation, was a fate worse than death. The lesson was that true strength doesn't lie in your ability to force others to look at you, but in your ability to make everyone agree not to see you. The psychology behind Bumpy's strategy was brilliant. He understood that the identity of a man like Sid was entirely external, built upon the fear and admiration he saw in the eyes of others. It was a house of cards. By removing those reflections, by replacing them with a void of indifference and contempt, Bumpy removed the very foundation of Sid's identity. He forced him to confront his own insignificance, a psychological terror from which he could not defend himself. Bumpy didn't attack Sid's body. He attacked the image Sid had of himself, and without that image the man crumbled. Sid's punishment also served as a powerful unifying mechanism for the community. By leading them in a collective act of repudiation, Bumpy empowered them. He gave them a sense of agency, transforming their passive indignation into effective action. They were no longer helpless victims of crime. They were the enforcers of community justice. This, in turn, strengthened their loyalty to Bumpy, not out of fear but out of gratitude and mutual respect. He defended them, and they, in turn, defended his authority. It was a symbiotic exchange of power that men like Sid could never comprehend. This event demonstrates the sophistication of Bumpy's government. He was not a tyrant who ruled by decree, but a shrewd politician who governed by consensus, even if that consensus was guided by his iron fist. He understood that to maintain power in the long term, it was necessary to align his interests with the interests of the community, or at least create the perception of that alignment. The line that Silky Sid crossed was not merely an arbitrary rule. It was the boundary that separated Bumpy's business from the safety and dignity of the people of Harlem. By defending it so ruthlessly, he was, in fact, defending himself. Ultimately, the story of the line no one crossed is the definition of Bumpy Johnson's legacy. He was a criminal, a violent man, an exploiter, but he was also a man with a code, and that code, however twisted, gave an appearance of order to his world. The social annihilation of Silky Sid was the clearest demonstration of this code in action. It was a statement that, in Bumpy's kingdom, even predators had to follow rules, and the most important rule of all was, you do not dishonor the house. The lesson resonates to this day. The most absolute power is that which can make the whole world pretend you don't exist.